Today we are diving into the world of Hollywood portraits, specifically focusing on the stunning work of Matthieu Zurowski, who nails this classic style every time. Now you might be wondering, why cover Hollywood portraits when there are already tons of tutorials out there? Well, here's the deal. Most of these videos get bogged down in technical details that honestly aren't the heart of what makes a Hollywood portrait great. If I had to pick the easiest type of photography to teach from a technical standpoint, it would be a Hollywood portrait. Seriously, it's that straightforward. But technical skills alone won't give you a great portrait. So let's clear up some common misconceptions right from the start. First off, Hollywood portraits aren't really a style with rigid rules. When people talk about Hollywood portraits, they often show photos like these. And sure, there's a common aesthetic thread running through them. But what if I told you that these photos are also Hollywood portraits? Yep, sometimes even by the same photographers. So what exactly are Hollywood portraits? It's a broad term for a type of photography that grew out of the Hollywood film industry in the mid-90s. Back then, with the booming film industry, studios needed tons of photos for marketing, pictures that captured the essence of a character or showcased the rising stars of the silver screen. This meant that portrait photography was as much about creating a fictional persona as it was about capturing the real person behind the character. Now, here's something interesting. The world of film production was, and still is, pretty closed off, with only a handful of photographers getting access to the most famous sets. And while we often admire these photos for their quality, let's be real, much of the popularity comes from the famous faces in them, not necessarily the technical brilliance behind the camera. Back in the early days of Hollywood, photographers were working with low sensitivity film, the equivalent of shooting with ISO 5 or even lower, imagine that. Plus they had to deal with low dynamic range and some seriously unstable flashes that relied on fast-burning powder. Even when flash bulbs became more common, lighting was still tricky. Many photographers had to use the same equipment as filmmakers, like continuous lights with Fresnel or oval reflectors. These lights weren't particularly powerful, which meant that diffusion, meaning softening the light, wasn't really an option. Much of what we consider the Hollywood-style lighting came from these hard, direct light sources, more out of the necessity than choice. So what's the takeaway here? First off, don't get caught up in searching for some hidden mystical truths in photography elements that weren't crafted with artistic intention. Much of what we consider Hollywood style emerged from external limitations, not deliberate artistic choices. And here's the second takeaway. You can create absolutely stunning portraits even within these limitations. In fact, when you see how legendary some of these photos have become, it's clear that the technical aspects are far from the most important part. Now, if we've covered that, let's dive into the technical side of things. I will show you the setup used during Matthieu's test shots and from his portraits workshops where he also showed Hollywood approach. It's fun to be there and see that setting up lights and talking about it takes less than 15 minutes from more than a 6 hours long workshop. That's because lighting is just a small fraction of what a skilled photographer wants to teach to his students. Most Hollywood portraits are shot with hard light sources. You can either use continuous lights or strobes, it doesn't really make a difference in this context. You will often see a strong hair light in these portraits, but it's not always necessary. For Matthieu's setup, we placed 2 spotlights behind the actor on either side, but you could easily get by with just one light from the back or even none at all, depending on the look you are going for. It's best to set up the hair lights first, to make sure they don't spill too much onto the model's face. The goal is to create a nice rim of light around the head and shoulders. The face, on the other hand, is lit by a strong single-point light source. And that's it. Really, you can move the lights around as much as you want, but it won't drastically change the outcome of your photo. When working with hard lighting, it's you and your subject who adapt to the light, not the other way around. Of course, if you are photographing someone who's not used to being in front of the camera, you might want to play it safe with softer lights. That's something most other videos don't cover. Hollywood portraits are, after all, portraits of actors. It's much easier to work with them compared to someone who gets stiff or uncomfortable in front of the lens. The choice of lighting setup is mostly influenced by these external factors, not by the photographer's desire to achieving a specific style. In most cases, if a photographer is aiming for a highly stylized look, the goal isn't a portrait, but rather fine art. Portrait photography is about revealing the subtleties and intricacies of the subject, not showcasing a particular style. So when setting up lights for a portrait, your primary concern should be ensuring they don't interfere with capturing the true essence of your subject. Take Antonio Platen for example. He's known for using just one old umbrella reflector with a strobe lamp for all his shots. Why? Because it's versatile and works well no matter how his subject is posed. And during most of his sessions, he's not even snapping photos. He's talking to his subject, making them feel comfortable and getting to know them. He prepares thoroughly, researching his subject beforehand and planning out the conversation. He's searching for the opportunity to capture the real person behind the facade. And his approach is so far removed from the gear he's using that he minimizes any technical distractions that could disrupt the process. Now let's talk about less tangible aspects of portrait photography, the kind of skills that are hard to teach in a workshop, let alone through a video from some random guy on YouTube. These are the soft skills that come with experience and practice, like making the subject comfortable and drawing out the true personality. While these aren't easy to learn from a tutorial, there are still a few practical tips you can keep in mind as you start your journey into portrait photography. These aren't hard rules by any means, but they are solid guidelines for beginners. First up, pay attention to the eyes. A well-lit eye with visible catchlight can make a world of difference in your portraits. Also, when working with a point light source, it's easy to cast shadows over one of the eyes. If the shadow is too deep, it can also make the catchlight disappear, which is usually something you want to avoid. You don't need to fully illuminate the entire eye, but be mindful of those catchlights. They add life to the portrait. If you are shooting more straightforward frontal portraits, be aware of the shadow cast by the nose. Take a moment to decide if those shadows are distracting. In Hollywood portraits, there's a lighting style known as the butterfly shadow, which is the shadow that forms directly under the nose. It's generally considered flattering as long as it doesn't extend too far down. When your subject is angled slightly to the side, pay close attention to how the hair light interacts with the skin. You don't want the hair light to illuminate the face too much. It's there to add a subtle rim of light, not to overpower the frontal light. The next thing is, keep in mind the depth of field you are working with. A shallow depth of field can help isolate your subject from the background, drawing more focus to their face and expression. However, be careful not to go too shallow, as you still want enough of the face in the focus, especially the eyes. For clean studio portraits, you can close the aperture quite a bit, since the background is usually simple and non-distracting. But in the case of Matthieu Zurowski's photos, he often prefers an incredibly shallow depth of field, even when the model is looking sideways. To keep the eyes sharp in these situations, he uses lens with tilt function. Now, this is a more advanced technique and isn't specifically tied to Hollywood style, but it can significantly enhance the quality of your images if you are aiming for a high level of technical precision. Keep in mind though that using tilt-shift optics requires much more time to set up before taking the shot, so there's always a trade-off between the time spent working with the model and perfecting your camera setup. Another important tip: experiment with where your subject is looking. Having them look slightly off camera can create a more candid, introspective vibe, which can be more engaging than a direct gaze depending on the mood you are trying to capture. This is actually something quite characteristic of Hollywood portraits. Actors rarely make direct eye contact with the camera, just like they don't look directly into the lens during filming. In portrait photography, we often strive for that feeling of observing the subject in their own world, as if from a distance unnoticed. This sense of immersion is hard to achieve if the model is looking straight at you. Lastly, pay close attention to the highlights on the hair. If the light is too strong, it can create harsh, blown-out spots that distract from the overall image. Aim for a soft balance where the hair catches the light gently, adding to the portrait without overpowering it. And that's pretty much it. To wrap things up, in the next video I will take a closer look at some of Matthieu's images, both before and after grading, and see if we can recreate some of that magic ourselves.